I have the privilege of introducing our last speaker, not only of today, but of the entire Institute, Terry Nichols Clark. Terry Nichols Clark is professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago and the international coordinator of the Fiscal Austerity and Urban Innovation Project, which is surveying city officials across the U.S. and in 35 other countries. His research interests include urban sociology, transnational processes, and the use of decision-making theory to approach urban politics and social phenomena. He holds MA and PhD degrees from Columbia University and has taught at Columbia, Harvard, Yale, the Sorbonne, and UCLA, and has worked at the Brookings Institution, the Urban Institute, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. He has consulted with many local governments and civic and financial institutions over the past 35 years. A prolific scholar, and his publications are too numerous to mention, but Professor Clark has written or contributed to over 400 journal articles, reports, and book chapters. He has edited several volumes, including The City as Entertainment Machine, Urban Innovation, and Urban Policy Analysis, Directions for Future Research. And he has co-authored numerous books, including Financial Handbook for Mayors and City Managers, and City Money, Political Processes, Fiscal Strain, and Retrenchment. Please join me in welcoming Professor Clark.
Thank you. Grand introduction. It's good to be here. Migration is a fascinating topic and sort of a litmus test of how much the world is changing with globalization in particular, particularly marked since 1989. Things are just changing very rapidly all around the world. The models, in terms of the topic of this conference, of what drives migration and why, is more complicated in the sense that we have more models, I'm suggesting, more dynamics. I heard a few in the last minutes about how things work in the Middle East in ways that don't seem to fit what one might imagine. At the same time, what we tend to have is not the old models totally disappearing. They're still there in some locations, maybe in rural areas or some neighborhoods. Or I sometimes say in the city of Chicago, you can find almost all these things. If you look, there are all kinds of things going on. And so what does this mean for us trying to get an overview that's not too much, if you will, anti-generalizing of saying each person is a rule unto his or herself, or each city or each migration decision is different. There are some generalities, and what I'm going to try to do is fill in some of the spaces in between to try to get a sense of what's changing and why. One quick distinction is between descriptive and analytical, and that's found in a number of the readings and that you've been looking at, as well as in the press and so forth. As descriptive, we'll often say, in the U.S., the migration rate is X. Well, in France, it's that. Or in Chicago, it's this, and people are moving less to Chicago or away from Chicago than they did before. The problem with this is twofold. One, anything that has a city name or a nation name is not really an analysis. It's more descriptive. The question is why? Why is Chicago or the U.S. or Dubai changing? And that is more complicated. It tends to, if for instance, is it because of age? Is it because of new regulations? Is it because of the welfare benefits? And how to put those together so that we can begin to interpret what Dubai means or what Chicago means in the case of a particular example like that. So we need often better data, and we often need lower level data. For example, in Chicago, we have some neighborhoods, blue-collar industrial neighborhoods, have been declining since the 1950s in general. Around the steel works in the South Side, there's massive depopulation and so forth. At the same time, there's a doubling in the population size of young professionals on the near North Side within the last 10 years, even though the city is... So my point is the city or the metro area as a whole may be doing one thing, but the causal dynamics are very different in many different locations. And the total descriptive number, or what is the growth or the decline rate of the whole metro area or the whole city of Chicago, is an aggregation of many complex processes. So what I'm going to try to do is fill in some of the specifics with a few examples in ways that we can document and systematize this with work we have in progress. I suggested some readings which are posted, and I'll just briefly mention sort of some key points from them for those of you who don't remember every line. I put up something called City Money, it's a chapter from a book called City Money that I did with several talented students here, maybe it was in 1983, I think it was published. At that time, most of the models of migration tended to be that people move to jobs. Jobs are the big drivers. Or if they're not just jobs, they're sort of private sector characteristics of individuals. Government, amenities, more complicated things were largely not included in a central manner in most migration work. City Money, in the selection that I put out for you, did two things that were moving in this newer direction. One, it talked about government policies and how they could make a difference, and especially we had data on welfare benefits and tax burdens, and showed that people tended to move away. Middle-class people, people above the poverty line, moved away from higher tax burden areas. Some of the poorer people tended to at least there was a net migration, such that there were fewer people moving away from areas with higher welfare benefits, fewer disadvantaged persons. So we showed, and this is after you control for 15 or so other standard variables: income, education, race, population size, and the like. So then in the conclusion, I stress the degree to which many of the rules from the past are changing in post-industrial society. Chicago is a perfect example. When we have industrial neighborhoods in Chicago. We have, however, lots of others that are not, and the rules are often very different in those too. And as we move toward post-industrial society, we tend to have fewer unions, fewer big factories. We tend to have smaller jobs. They tend to be more professionalized. They tend to value more creativity and individualism. And these are in conflict with the traditional industrial sorts of jobs and dynamics. And I suggested that the new smaller economy or smaller firms tends to more reflect preferences of individuals. Why is that critical for migration? In the old model, you would move to the factory. You'd leave Mississippi, you'd leave rural Iowa, you'd move to Detroit or Chicago in order to work in the big factory, the old model. The newer model is, I sometimes summarize as Sally. Sally's a second-year student at the University of Chicago, and she got bored. So she spent a summer in San Diego, and then when the fall came around, Mom said, "Sally, it's time to go back to the USC." And she said, "Mom, I'm going to stay in San Diego." Mom said, "Oh, really?" So she said, Mom said, "Well, I don't think you should do that, Sally." And Sally said, "Yes, I'd really like to, Mom." And Mom said, "Well, I'm not going to send you any more checks. If you're going to stay there, you've got to make your own way." So Sally then opens a veggie burger stand on the beach. This illustrates Sally's preferences drive the economy of San Diego. The preferences came first, the migration then followed, and then the economy of San Diego was enhanced by Sally's veggie burger stand. She did not get invited to San Diego to work in a veggie burger shop. She chose San Diego first. My point is that's a new model where the individual is the driver, and we're having a dramatic heightening of citizen empowerment, of individualization, so we've got both of these going on, and we've got measures of each. And so the chapter then pointed out, even in the data which were available then in the 1970s and 80s, we had evidence of both of those going on, but we didn't have a very clear way of identifying how and why, especially Sally's move was working. Okay, we've been clarifying Sally for 20 years now, and we've got better ways of trying to interpret Sally and John and others who move for non-standard, non-job reasons, and that's what I mainly want to focus on. But filling in some of the others who've moved in this direction, there's a paper by Ed Glazer in the City as an Entertainment Machine book, which I edited, And Glaser is probably the top urban economist in the world today. He's a professor at Harvard, has a degree from here, and he has a paper called Consumer City. That is, he's done dozens of papers, many, if not most of which, and even his new book, and he basically stresses more the job dynamic model in the book. Nevertheless, in this paper, Consumer City, he quasi-reverses it. He shows how the consumer may be attracted by cinemas or by other things in a city, and one can look at such things as so-called reverse migration. If you go at rush hour to a big city freeway and see how many lanes, how many cars are going out to the suburbs and how many are coming back in. And if they're more, if people are going to the suburbs to work, that's one model. If instead they're coming back, if you have people coming from the suburbs at 7 p.m. or 6 p.m. as they do from the suburbs, they're coming to downtown for consumption, for going to Navy Pier, restaurants, opera, all kinds of consumption activities. Okay, and models of each of those are needed. Okay, so Glaser I'm just mentioning as an example of economists who began to work on amenities about 25 years ago. That is, the job model people talk of as an economic model, but smart economists would say that people don't maximize their income, they maximize their utility. And the utility is defined as utility equals income plus amenities. And amenities are what I'm really going to focus on. Amenities are those things you don't pay for through a market. You don't buy a meal, you don't buy a car, but you get it because you are in an area where there's clean air, there's a nice view, there's a beach. Those are things or public education, low crime rates. You don't pay for those through a market, but they have a huge, important impact. I ask my students in most every class, how many of you would take a job in a town of 2,000 in South Dakota that paid you $100,000, or would you take the same job that paid you half, $50,000 in New York, Chicago, and LA? And what do you think they say?